The call came in on a Thursday morning, October 25th, 1990. Rachel's mother, Dorothy Mercer, had driven to the steel fabrication plant on Route 7 after Rachel failed to pick up her daughter, Emma, from school the previous afternoon. Dorothy found Rachel's Cavalier exactly where it shouldn't be, still parked in the employee lot, driver's door hanging open like a mouth frozen mid-scream, keys dangling from the ignition. The engine was stone cold. Frost glittered on the hood. Rachel's purse sat on the passenger seat untouched. Her thermos of coffee, still half full, rested in the cup holder. Paul Hendricks had been a detective for only 3 years when he arrived at the scene that morning. He was 31, ambitious, and believed that every puzzle had a solution if you looked hard enough. The factory sat on a lonely stretch of road carved between forested hills, the kind of place where cell service was spotty, and the nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away. The building itself was a low, corrugated metal structure that hummed with the sound of machinery during operating hours. But on that particular morning, with the plant shut down for maintenance, the silence was absolute. First thing that struck me, Hendricks would recall decades later, his voice still carrying the weight of that October day, was how quiet it was. No birds, no wind, just this heavy stillness that made you want to whisper. And the fog, it was clinging to everything, hovering right at knee height like it was something alive, something watching. The employee parking lot was unpaved gravel, mixed with crushed slag from the plant, and it crunched under Hendricks' boots as he approached Rachel's vehicle. Dorothy Mercer stood beside a sheriff's deputy near the entrance, her face carved from worry, clutching a framed photo of Rachel and 6-year-old Emma. The little girl in the picture was smiling, gap-toothed and trusting. Rachel looked tired but content, one arm wrapped around her daughter's shoulders. Hendricks examined the car first. No signs of forced entry, no blood, no struggle visible inside the vehicle. Rachel's jacket was gone, but her work gloves, she always kept a pair in the car, were missing one. He found the right glove on the passenger floor. The left one was outside near the driver's door, partially pressed into the gravel as if it had been dropped or torn off. "Ms. Mercer?" Hendricks approached Dorothy carefully. "When did you last speak to Rachel?" "Yesterday morning." Dorothy's voice trembled. "She dropped Emma at my house before her shift. Said she'd pick her up around 7 after work. Rachel's never late, never. When she didn't show by 8, I called the plant. No answer. I drove here this morning and found this. Did she mention anything unusual? Anyone bothering her? Problems with her ex-husband?" Dorothy shook her head firmly. "Tom moved to Columbus 2 years ago. He sends money for Emma, but they barely talk. Rachel kept to herself. Worked, took care of Emma, that's all. She didn't have enemies, detective. She was just trying to survive." Hendricks walked the perimeter of the lot, his deputy, Kyle Brennan, following close. The factory backed up against a thick stretch of Appalachian forest, oak and maple mostly, their canopy dense enough to block most sunlight even in summer. In late October, with leaves carpeting the ground in shades of copper and rust, the woods felt like something from another time, ancient and indifferent to human concerns. "Paul," Kyle's voice was tight, "you need to see this." 20 feet into the tree line, just past where the gravel gave way to soft earth and decomposing leaves, Kyle knelt beside a rotting log covered in moss. The ground there was muddy from recent rain, and pressed deep into the soft soil was a track. Not a boot print, not a deer or bear, something else. Hendricks crouched beside it, pulling a small flashlight from his belt, though it was full daylight. The track was roughly 14 inches long, elongated, with what appeared to be 4 distinct toe impressions at the front and a broader heel at the back. The depth of the impression suggested significant weight, but the shape was wrong, too narrow for a bear, too large for a coyote or dog. The toe marks were spaced oddly, and there were signs of claws, long, deliberate indentations at the tip of each toe. "Could be a dog," Kyle offered, but his voice lacked conviction. "That's no dog," Hendricks murmured. "Look at the depth. Whatever made this was heavy, and the gait—" He stood, scanning the area. There were more tracks, leading deeper into the forest, spaced far apart. Whatever this was, it was moving fast, long strides. They followed the tracks for about 50 yards before they vanished at a rocky outcropping where the ground turned hard and left no impressions. The forest here was darker, the trees pressing close, and that unnatural silence persisted. Hendricks felt the hair on his arms prickle. 31 years old, rational, trained, and yet something about this place made his instincts scream. Back at the parking lot, the crime scene techs were processing Rachel's car. Hendricks examined the vehicle's exterior more carefully in the growing daylight. That's when he saw them. 4 parallel scratches running vertically down the tan paint of the rear driver's side fender. They were deep, cutting through paint and primer, scoring the metal itself. They ran from just below the taillight down to the bottom of the fender, evenly spaced, roughly 2 inches apart. Kyle, get photos of these. What do you think made them? Hendricks ran his finger along one of the gouges. Something with claws, or someone with a tool trying to make it look like claws. The techs found no fingerprints on the car exterior, no blood, no hair, no fibers. Rachel Mercer had simply vanished between approximately 6:30 p.m. when her shift ended, and the next morning. The last person to see her was her supervisor, Marcus Webb, who watched her clock out at 6:28 p.m. and walked toward the parking lot alone. Marcus Webb was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, with grease permanently embedded under his fingernails and a face weathered by decades of factory work. Hendricks interviewed him in the plant's small break room, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, the smell of burnt coffee and machine oil heavy in the air. Rachel was a good worker, Marcus said, his voice rough from years of shouting over machinery. Quiet, dependable, showed up every day, did her job, went home to her kid. Nothing unusual yesterday. She clocked out same time as always. Did you see anyone hanging around the parking lot? Any vehicles that didn't belong? No, sir. It was just the evening shift leaving. Maybe a dozen of us. We all parked in the same lot. I watched Rachel head to her car, then I drove off myself. That was the last I saw of her. What about the woods behind the plant? Ever have problems back there? Trespassers, drifters? Marcus shifted uncomfortably. Not trespassers exactly, but some of the guys, they don't like going back there, especially after dark. Hendricks leaned forward. Why? Noises mostly. Sounds that don't belong. A few months back, Tim Kowalski, he works maintenance, said he heard something moving through the trees during a night shift. Heavy footsteps, branches breaking. He thought maybe it was a bear, but when he looked, he couldn't see anything. Just darkness and fog. Bears are common in this area. That's what I told him. Marcus met Hendricks' eyes. But then other people started hearing things too. Sarah Chen, she does quality control. She swears she saw something watching from the tree line one evening when she was locking up. She said it was tall, taller than a man, standing between 2 oaks. But when she blinked, it was gone. Did she report this? To me, yeah. I told her it was probably a deer standing on its hind legs or shadows playing tricks. She didn't seem convinced, but she let it go. Didn't want to seem crazy, you know. Hendricks made notes, his mind working through possibilities. Fear in a workplace could spread like a virus, especially in an isolated location like this. One person hears a noise, interprets it as something threatening, and suddenly everyone's on edge. Confirmation bias, shared delusion. He'd read about it in his psychology courses at the police academy. But those scratches on the car, those were real. Those tracks in the mud, also real. Over the next 72 hours, Hendricks and his team conducted an exhaustive search of the surrounding forest. Volunteers from the community joined, nearly 200 people combing through acres of dense woodland, calling Rachel's name, checking every ravine, every abandoned hunting shack, every possible place a person could hide or be hidden. Search dogs picked up Rachel's scent from her car and followed it about 30 yards into the woods, before losing it completely at the same rocky outcropping where the tracks had disappeared. It's like she just evaporated, the canine handler told Hendricks, frustration evident in his voice. The dogs are trained for this. They don't just lose a scent in open air. Something disrupted the trail. Heavy rain had moved through the area on the second day of searching, turning the forest floor into a muddy morass and washing away any remaining evidence. The investigation shifted to other angles. Rachel's ex-husband, Tom Mercer, had a solid alibi. He'd been at work in Columbus, verified by multiple witnesses and time cards. Rachel's finances were modest but stable. No large withdrawals, no secret bank accounts, no evidence of plans to disappear voluntarily. Her apartment was neat, organized, with Emma's school permission slips on the refrigerator and a grocery list on the counter. This was not a woman planning to vanish. Hendricks interviewed everyone who knew Rachel. Co-workers described her as reserved but friendly. Neighbors said she kept to herself but was always polite. Emma's school teacher said Rachel never missed a parent-teacher conference. Dorothy Mercer insisted her daughter had no enemies, no dangerous habits, no reason to run. She was just getting her life together, Dorothy told Hendricks during one of many interviews, tears streaming down her weathered face. After the divorce, after all that pain, she was finally okay. She had Emma, she had a job, she was saving up to maybe buy a little house, and now she's just gone. How does someone just disappear? It was a question Hendricks couldn't answer. Not in 1990, not with the evidence they had. The case generated local media attention for a few weeks. Missing woman posters plastered in shop windows throughout Meigs County and the surrounding area. Rachel's face stared out from telephone poles and community bulletin boards. Tips came in, as they always do. Sightings that led nowhere. Theories that collapsed under scrutiny. A trucker claimed he'd seen a woman matching Rachel's description at a rest stop in Pennsylvania. Turned out to be someone else. A psychic called in, insisting Rachel was near water. They dragged 3 local ponds, found nothing. As autumn turned to winter, the investigation slowed. Hendricks continued working the case, but with no new leads, no body, no evidence of foul play beyond those ambiguous scratches and strange tracks, the trail went cold. By December, other cases demanded attention. A domestic violence homicide in Pomeroy, a string of burglaries in Middleport. Rachel Mercer became another file in another cabinet, another unsolved mystery in a department with limited resources and too many problems. But Hendricks kept the file on his desk. He'd pull it out late at night when the station was empty, reviewing witness statements, studying photos of those tracks in the mud, those scratches on the fender. He drove out to the factory parking lot on his days off, standing in the same spot where Rachel's car had been found, trying to imagine what had happened in those missing hours. The forest behind the plant seemed to watch him during those visits. He'd hear things sometimes, branches snapping deep in the woods, the rustle of movement through undergrowth. Once in early December, he'd heard what sounded like heavy footfalls moving parallel to him as he walked the tree line. He'd spun, hand on his weapon, flashlight cutting through the dusk. Nothing, just trees and fog and the skeletal remains of autumn leaves clinging to branches. "You're getting paranoid," he told himself. But he didn't go back there after dark again. Years passed. Hendricks rose through the ranks, eventually becoming sheriff. He married, had 2 daughters, watched them grow. Emma Mercer grew up without her mother, raised by her grandmother Dorothy, in a small house on the edge of town. Hendricks checked in on them occasionally, always hoping he'd have news, never able to deliver any. Emma became a quiet, serious young woman who rarely smiled. The absence of her mother was a wound that never healed, a question mark tattooed on her childhood. The case file remained unsolved. The steel fabrication plant closed in 1998, the building left to rust and decay. The forest slowly reclaimed the parking lot, weeds pushing through gravel, saplings taking root in the abandoned landscape. Other investigators looked at the case over the years, cold case units, independent journalists, even a true crime podcast in 2015. None of them got any further than Hendricks had, until 2024. In March of that year, a breakthrough emerged from an unexpected source. The Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation had been working through a backlog of old evidence using advanced DNA technology that hadn't existed in 1990. A single hair fiber, recovered from Rachel's car door handle during the original investigation and preserved in evidence storage for 3 decades, was reprocessed using genealogical DNA analysis. The call came to Sheriff Hendricks, now 65 and months from retirement, on a Tuesday afternoon. The analyst's voice was cautious but excited. "Sheriff, we have a match on the Rachel Mercer case. The DNA from that hair fiber, it's in the system now. We found a familial match through a genealogy database. Hendricks felt his heart rate spike. After 34 years, a lead. Who? That's the complicated part, sir. The DNA belongs to someone who was never a suspect. In fact, he was never even in Ohio in 1990, according to his records. But he's currently serving time in Pennsylvania for assault. His name is Vincent Holbrook. Was that just coincidence? Or the first thread in unraveling something we can't fully explain? Part 2. Vincent Holbrook was not the kind of man you'd forget easily. 6'4", 240 pounds, with a shaved head and a network of prison tattoos crawling up his neck. Born in 1968 in Erie, Pennsylvania, he'd spent most of his adult life drifting between construction jobs, bar fights, and short stints in county lockups. His criminal record was a catalogue of escalating violence: assault, battery, resisting arrest. In 2019, he'd beaten a man nearly to death outside a Pittsburgh sports bar over a spilled drink, earning him a 10-year sentence at SCI Fayette. When Hendricks and a team from the Ohio BCI arrived at the prison to interview Holbrook in April 2024, the man seemed genuinely confused. Rachel Mercer. Holbrook's voice was a low rasp, damaged from years of cigarettes and shouting. He sat across from them in a grey interview room, his massive hands cuffed to the table. "Never heard that name in my life. Who the hell is she?" Hendricks slid a photo across the table. Rachel's face, young and tired, taken from her work ID in 1990. "She disappeared from southeastern Ohio on October 24, 1990. Your DNA was found on her vehicle." Holbrook stared at the photo, his expression unreadable. "I wasn't in Ohio in 1990. I was in Pennsylvania. Erie, mostly. Working construction." "Can you prove that? 34 years ago? Man, I can barely remember last month, but I've never been to Ohio in my life. Ask my parole officers. Ask anyone. I don't travel. Never had reason to." The BCI agent, a sharp-eyed woman named Linda Reeves, leaned forward. "Mr. Holbrook, DNA doesn't lie. We found your genetic material on the victim's car. We need to know how it got there." "Then your test is wrong." Holbrook's jaw tightened. "Or someone's setting me up." "Because I didn't know this woman, I didn't touch her car, and I sure as hell didn't hurt anybody in Ohio." The interview lasted 3 hours. Holbrook maintained his innocence throughout, never wavering, never lawyering up. He seemed genuinely bewildered by the accusation. Hendricks had interrogated hundreds of suspects over his career. He knew the tells of a liar, the micro-expressions of guilt. Holbrook showed none of them. Just anger, confusion, and a weary resignation that came from years of being blamed for things, guilty or not. Back in Ohio, Hendricks and his team dug deeper into Holbrook's background. They pulled employment records, interviewed old associates, tracked his movements through the late 80s and early 90s. Every piece of evidence they found supported his claim. Vincent Holbrook had been in Pennsylvania in October 1990, working on a residential construction project in Erie. Time cards, foreman's testimony, even photos from a job site showing Holbrook and his crew. The timeline didn't work. He couldn't have been in Ohio. So how did his DNA get on Rachel's car? Deputy Chief Morgan Ellis asked during a case review meeting. Morgan had joined the department in 2005, years after Rachel's disappearance, but she'd taken a personal interest in the case. She was thorough, relentless, the kind of investigator who never accepted easy answers. "Contamination?" someone suggested. "Maybe the evidence was mishandled." "The hair was properly preserved," Linda Reeves said via video conference from the BCI lab. "Chain of custody is clean. No contamination in the lab. That DNA came from Rachel Mercer's car in 1990. I'd stake my career on it." Hendricks rubbed his eyes, exhaustion and frustration blending into a headache. "What about familial DNA? Could it be a relative of Holbrook's?" "That's what we're exploring now," Linda said. "We're building out Holbrook's family tree through genealogical databases. If it's not him, it could be a brother, cousin, uncle, someone closely related." The genealogical research took weeks, but it yielded results. Vincent Holbrook had a younger brother, Daniel Holbrook, born in 1971. The brothers had been estranged for most of their adult lives following a violent falling out in the mid-90s. Daniel had left Pennsylvania in 1989, according to his last known address records, and had moved around frequently: West Virginia, Kentucky, Ohio. He'd worked odd jobs, mostly manual labor, staying off the grid. No criminal record, no driver's license after 1992, no tax returns filed after 1994. For all intents and purposes, Daniel Holbrook had disappeared. "Get me everything we can find on Daniel," Hendricks ordered. "Employment records, addresses, associates. I want to know everywhere he went and everyone he knew." The search was painstakingly slow. In the early 90s, record-keeping was largely paper-based, and a man who wanted to stay invisible could do so relatively easily. But gradually, a picture emerged. Daniel Holbrook had worked at a lumber yard in Parkersburg, West Virginia, in early 1990. He'd left that job in August. From September through November of 1990, there was a gap. No employment records, no address, nothing. Then Morgan found something. A handwritten log from a small motel called the Riverside Inn, located just 12 miles from the steel fabrication plant where Rachel worked. The motel had closed in 2003, its records boxed up and stored in a county archive building. Buried in those dusty ledgers was a registration card from October 15, 1990. The name was barely legible, but Morgan was certain: Daniel Holbrook. He'd stayed for 2 weeks, paying cash, checking out on October 30th. 5 days after Rachel disappeared. "We need to find Daniel Holbrook," Hendricks said, "now." But Daniel Holbrook was a ghost. No death certificate, no current address, no social media presence, no digital footprint of any kind. It was as if he'd stepped off the face of the earth sometime in the mid-90s. Vincent Holbrook, still incarcerated, agreed to another interview. This time, when they mentioned his brother, his demeanor changed. "Danny." Vincent's voice was softer, laced with something that might have been regret. "I haven't talked to Danny in almost 30 years. "Where is he?" Hendricks asked. "Hell if I know. We had a fight in 96, bad one. He took off and I never saw him again. Tried to find him a few times over the years, but Danny, he didn't want to be found." "Why not?" Vincent was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. Danny had problems. Mental stuff. He'd get these episodes: paranoia, aggression, hearing things that weren't there. Our old man used to beat the hell out of him, and I think it broke something inside. He'd disappear for weeks sometimes, living rough in the woods. Said he felt safer out there than around people. Did he ever hurt anyone during these episodes? Not that I know of. He'd just vanish. Then he'd come back, different, quieter, like part of him stayed out there in the trees. Was he ever in Ohio? Could have been. Danny wondered. He'd pick up work wherever he could find it. Construction, factory jobs, anything that paid under the table. He didn't trust banks, didn't trust the government, lived off the grid as much as possible. Hendricks felt the pieces shifting, forming a new picture. Did Danny ever talk about a woman named Rachel Mercer? No, but Danny didn't talk much about anything. He kept his life private, even from me. After the interview, Hendricks stood in the prison parking lot watching storm clouds gather over the Pennsylvania hills. 34 years. He'd been chasing this case for 34 years, and finally, they had a suspect. Daniel Holbrook, a man with mental health issues, a history of isolation, and a documented presence near the scene when Rachel vanished. But where was he now? The investigation took on new urgency. The FBI was brought in due to the potential for interstate flight. Missing persons databases were cross-referenced. John and Jane Doe records from the past 3 decades were reviewed, looking for any unidentified remains that might match Daniel Holbrook's description. Meanwhile, Morgan Ellis returned to southeastern Ohio, to the long-abandoned factory and the forest that surrounded it. She walked the same paths Hendricks had walked in 1990, studying the terrain, trying to understand what might have happened that October evening. The factory was a ruin now, windows shattered, roof partially collapsed, graffiti covering the walls. Nature was consuming it slowly, vines crawling up the corrugated metal, small trees pushing through cracks in the foundation. The parking lot was barely recognizable, reclaimed by grass and saplings, but the forest behind it remained largely unchanged, the same dense canopy, the same shadowed depths. Morgan ventured into the tree line with a GPS unit and camera, documenting the area. The silence was still profound even after all these years. No birdsong, no insects buzzing. Just the whisper of wind through branches and the distant sound of the river below. She found the rocky outcropping where the tracks had vanished in 1990. Moss covered it now, thick and green. Beyond it, the forest sloped downward toward a ravine, steep and treacherous. She descended carefully, using exposed roots and saplings for handholds. At the bottom, a small creek flowed, clear and cold. That's where she found it. Wedged between two boulders at the creek's edge, partially buried in silt and decades of leaf decay, was a boot. Old, rotted, the leather cracked and moldy, but still recognizable as a work boot, size large, the kind a man doing manual labor might wear. Morgan photographed it in place, then carefully extracted it from the silt. Inside the tongue of the boot, faded but still legible, was a name written in permanent marker, D. Holbrook. She radioed back to headquarters immediately. "I've got something. You're going to want to send a team out here." The FBI's evidence recovery team arrived within hours, treating the ravine as a potential crime scene. They set up a grid search, combing every inch of the area. What they found over the next week painted a disturbing picture. 30 yards downstream from where Morgan found the boot, they discovered remnants of a makeshift camp, fire pit stones arranged in a circle, rusted cans, fragments of a tarp. Someone had lived here, at least temporarily. Carbon dating on the charcoal from the fire pit suggested it had last been used sometime in the early to mid-1990s. Buried nearby, they found personal items. A water-damaged wallet containing a West Virginia ID card for Daniel Holbrook, issued in 1989. A pocket knife with his initials carved into the handle. Scraps of clothing too deteriorated to be useful. And bones. Not human bones, animal bones. Dozens of them. Deer, raccoon, opossum, some smaller creatures. They'd been cracked open, the marrow extracted. Some showed signs of gnaw marks. The forensic anthropologist examining them noted unusual patterns. These weren't killed by a predator, Dr. Sarah Yamamoto explained, holding up a deer femur in her gloved hands. The bones were processed deliberately, broken open with tools or rocks to access the marrow. This suggests someone living out here, surviving off the land, possibly for an extended period. "How long?" Hendricks asked. "Hard to say definitively, but based on the accumulation and the condition of the remains, I'd estimate months, maybe longer." The implications were clear. Daniel Holbrook had been living in the forest behind the factory in late 1990, hidden, isolated, surviving like something feral. The motel registration showed he'd checked in on October 15th, but perhaps he hadn't stayed there the entire time. Perhaps he'd spent his nights in the woods, only using the motel room as a mailing address or storage. But they still hadn't found Daniel himself. No human remains. No evidence of what had happened to him after Rachel's disappearance. Then a hunter came forward. Gerald Moss, 73 years old, had been hunting these woods since he was a boy. When he saw the news coverage of the excavation, he contacted the sheriff's department with a story he'd never told anyone, fearing people would think him crazy. Hendricks and Morgan interviewed him at his home, a small cabin overlooking the river valley. "It was November of 1990, Gerald began, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee mug. "I was out bow hunting deer early morning, just after dawn. I came across this camp down in the ravine. Looked like someone had been living rough. I figured it was a homeless guy, maybe a drifter. Didn't think much of it." "Did you see anyone?" Morgan asked. "Not then, but I heard something, voices maybe, or I don't know, it was strange, like someone arguing with themselves. I decided to get out of there, give whoever it was their space. But as I was leaving, I saw him." "Daniel Holbrook?" "I don't know his name, but there was a man, tall, thin, dirty. He was standing about 50 yards off, partially hidden behind a tree, just watching me. His clothes were torn, his hair was long and matted, and his eyes—" Gerald paused, the memory clearly troubling him even after 3 decades. His eyes looked wrong, wild, like he wasn't completely there anymore. "Did he approach you?" "No. We just stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds. Then he turned and walked deeper into the forest. Didn't run, just walked, slow and deliberate, like he knew I wouldn't follow. And I didn't. Something about him scared me. And I've been hunting these woods my whole life. I've faced bears, gotten lost in blizzards. But that man, he felt dangerous in a different way. Did you ever see him again? Gerald shook his head. Never. I avoided that part of the forest for months afterward. When I finally went back, the camp was gone. Everything cleared out or scattered, like he'd never been there at all. The timeline was coming together. Daniel Holbrook, mentally unstable and living rough in the forest, had been in the immediate vicinity when Rachel Mercer disappeared. His DNA, or more precisely, his brother's DNA, close enough to match familiarly, had been found on her car. He'd left behind a camp and personal effects, then vanished without a trace. But critical questions remained. Where was Rachel's body? What exactly had happened that night? And where was Daniel Holbrook now? The answer to the last question came from an unexpected source, a small-town newspaper archive in Montana. A junior FBI analyst named Trevor Kim, working through databases of unidentified deaths, found a police report from December 1990. A body had been found frozen in the mountains outside Kalispell, Montana. A male approximately 20 to 30 years old, dead from apparent exposure. No ID, no wallet, no way to identify him. He'd been buried in a county cemetery under the name John Doe 12 to 90. The physical description matched Daniel Holbrook. The timeline matched. December was 2 months after Rachel disappeared. Montana was nearly 2,000 miles from Ohio, but for someone determined to disappear, to run, it was reachable. Exhumation orders were filed. In late May 2024, John Doe 1290 was disinterred from his unmarked grave in Montana. DNA analysis confirmed what they'd suspected. It was Daniel Holbrook. He'd died alone in the mountains, far from home, his identity unknown for 34 years. But his death didn't answer the central question: what had happened to Rachel Mercer? With Daniel dead and unable to answer for his actions, the investigation focused on evidence. The FBI brought in cadaver dogs to search the ravine and surrounding forest in Ohio. Ground-penetrating radar was deployed. Every inch of terrain within a mile of the factory was examined. Nothing. No remains. No grave. No sign of Rachel. Then a forensic botanist named Dr. Marcus Lyle, brought in to analyze plant growth patterns in the ravine, made an observation that changed everything. "There's an anomaly here," he said, gesturing to a section of the creek bank about 40 yards from where Daniel's camp had been. "See how the vegetation pattern changes? The trees are younger here, different species, and the soil composition is inconsistent with the surrounding area." "Meaning what?" Hendricks asked. "Meaning something disturbed this area significantly sometime in the past. The ground was excavated or disrupted, then nature reclaimed it. Given the age of the trees growing here, I'd estimate they're 30 to 35 years old. The disturbance likely occurred in the late 80s or early 90s. They dug, carefully, methodically, sifting every shovelful of earth through screens. 3 feet down they found fabric, synthetic material consistent with the coveralls Rachel had been wearing. 4 feet down, they found bones. Rachel Mercer had been buried in a shallow grave beside the creek, hidden beneath decades of growth, her body finally coming home after 34 years in the darkness. But even in discovery, mysteries remained. The bones told a story, but not a complete one. Dr. Yamamoto's analysis revealed no signs of blunt force trauma, no gunshot wounds, no obvious cause of death. The hyoid bone in the neck was intact, ruling out manual strangulation. Toxicology was impossible after so much time. Whatever had killed Rachel Mercer had left no marks on her skeleton, and there were other details that didn't quite fit. Scattered among the remains were more animal bones, not part of the grave, but mixed in the surrounding soil. Marks on some of Rachel's ribs showed unusual scoring, patterns that Dr. Yamamoto struggled to explain. "These could be post-mortem damage from scavengers," she said carefully. "After burial, animals sometimes dig into graves, but the pattern is unusual. The marks are very regular, almost deliberate." Hendricks stood at the gravesite as evening fell over the forest, watching technicians carefully extract and catalogue every fragment of evidence. After 3 decades, he'd found Rachel. He'd brought her home. Emma Mercer, now 40 years old with children of her own, would finally be able to bury her mother. But the question that had haunted him all these years remained unanswered. What exactly happened in this forest on October 24th, 1990? Could one troubled man hiding in the woods really explain everything? Or was there something else out here, something we still don't understand? The discovery of Rachel Mercer's remains brought closure, but it also opened new wounds. Emma Mercer stood at her mother's gravesite in early June 2024, surrounded by family and the few friends who still remembered Rachel after all these years. The funeral was small, quiet, held at a cemetery overlooking the Ohio River. Dorothy Mercer had passed away in 2018, never knowing what became of her daughter. At least Emma could lay them to rest side by side now. Hendricks attended the service, standing at a respectful distance. He'd aged into the role of witness, the keeper of stories no one else wanted to remember. When the ceremony ended and mourners dispersed, Emma approached him. "Thank you," she said simply. She had her mother's green eyes, though hers carried a hardness that came from growing up with unanswered questions, for never giving up. "I wish I could give you more answers," Hendricks replied. "We know where she is now. We know Daniel Holbrook was there. But what actually happened that night? Will I ever know?" Hendricks wanted to lie to offer comfort, but he'd always been honest with Emma. "I don't know. We're still investigating, still trying to understand." What he didn't tell her was how much the case still troubled him. The evidence didn't quite align. Daniel Holbrook was the obvious suspect, mentally unstable, living in the forest, his familial DNA on the car, his camp near the burial site. But something felt incomplete, like a puzzle with pieces missing, or pieces that belonged to a different puzzle entirely. Morgan Ellis felt it too. She'd become obsessed with the case in the final weeks, spending hours reviewing every detail, every photograph, every statement. One evening in mid-June, she came to Hendricks' office with a laptop and a troubled expression. "I've been going through the original case file from 1990, she said, setting the laptop on his desk. "There's testimony we didn't follow up on properly. Or maybe we couldn't follow up on it because it seemed too unreliable." "What testimony?" Morgan pulled up a scanned document, a witness statement from October 1990. A truck driver named Robert Haskins. He was driving Route 7 past the factory around 7 p.m. on the night Rachel disappeared. He called in a tip 3 days after she went missing, but it got filed away as non-credible. Hendricks leaned forward, reading the faded type. Robert Haskins, age 42, had been hauling freight from Parkersburg to Marietta. As he passed the factory, he'd noticed a car in the parking lot with its door open and lights on. He'd also seen something else. "I saw what I thought was a person standing at the tree line," Haskins' statement read. "But it was tall, maybe 7 feet. I figured it was a trick of the light or shadows. Didn't think much of it until I heard about the missing woman. Then I wondered if maybe I should call it in." "Why was this marked non-credible?" Morgan asked. Hendricks checked the notes attached to the statement. Interviewing officer noted that Haskins was uncertain about what he saw, said it was getting dark, admitted he might have been mistaken. The description didn't match any known suspect, so it got deprioritized. But what if he really did see someone? What if it was Daniel Holbrook? 7 feet tall. People misjudge height, especially at a distance in poor light. If Holbrook was standing on elevated ground, or if there were shadows playing tricks, it's possible. Hendricks studied the statement. Haskins is probably dead by now. This was 34 years ago. "I checked. He's alive. Retired, living in Athens. I already called him. He remembers that night. He's willing to talk to us." They drove to Athens the next morning, winding through the rolling hills of southeastern Ohio. Robert Haskins lived in a modest ranch house with a well-maintained yard and an American flag hanging from the porch. He was 76 now, but his mind was sharp, his memory clear. "I've thought about that night more times than I can count," Haskins said, settling into a recliner in his living room. His wife brought coffee, then left them to talk. "When I heard they found that poor woman's body after all these years, it all came back." "Tell us what you saw," Morgan said. "I was driving north on Route 7, probably around 7, maybe a few minutes after. It was October, so it was getting dark early. I came around the bend past the factory and saw a car in the parking lot, tan sedan, door open, interior light on. Struck me as odd because the plant looked closed, no other cars around. Did you stop? No, and I've regretted that ever since. I thought maybe someone was having car trouble, but I was running late on my delivery. Figured they'd handle it or call for help. But as I was passing, I looked toward the forest behind the lot and I saw something. The figure you mentioned in your statement? Haskins nodded slowly. It was standing at the edge of the trees, right where the parking lot met the woods. Tall, very tall. At first I thought it might be a person on a ladder or standing on something, but there was nothing there to stand on. It was just standing, completely still, facing toward the car. Could you see details, clothing, features? No, it was silhouetted against the trees, but the shape was wrong for a person. Too tall, like I said, and the proportions were off. The body was too thin, the limbs too long. I only saw it for a second or two as I drove past. When I looked in my rearview mirror, it was gone. Gone as in you couldn't see it anymore, or gone as in it moved. I don't know. The angle changed. The trees blocked my view. Could have moved. Could have just been shadows. I've gone back and forth on this for 30 years. Was it real? Was it my imagination? I was tired that night, been driving for 10 hours. The mind plays tricks. Hendricks set down his coffee cup. Mr. Haskins, in your original statement, you said you thought it might be relevant to the missing woman case. Why? If you thought it was just shadows or your imagination, why call it in? Haskins was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. Because of something else. Something I didn't mention in my statement because I knew it would sound crazy. Tell us now. About a mile past the factory, my headlights caught something running across the road. Fast, real fast, crossed from the riverside to the forest side in maybe 2 seconds. I hit my brakes, thought I was going to hit a deer, but it wasn't a deer. What was it? I don't know. It was on 2 legs, not 4. Upright. But it moved like an animal. Low, fast, powerful. By the time I stopped, it was gone into the trees. I sat there for a minute, heart pounding, trying to figure out what I'd seen. Then I told myself it was a person, maybe someone out jogging, though who the hell jogs on a dark highway at night? Or maybe a deer on its hind legs, though I've been seeing deer my whole life and never seen one move like that. Could it have been the same figure you saw at the factory? I don't see how. The factory was a mile back. I was doing 55. Nothing could have covered that distance that fast. But the height was similar. The way it moved, there was something similar about it, something not quite right. Morgan glanced at Hendricks. Did you report this to the police? No. Like I said, I convinced myself it was my imagination. Fatigue, long day, bad light, all the rational explanations. It wasn't until I heard about the missing woman that I started wondering if maybe I'd seen something important. But even then, what was I going to say? I saw a tall shadow and something ran across the road. They'd have thought I was drunk or crazy. After the interview, Hendricks and Morgan sat in the car outside Haskins' house, neither speaking for a long moment. Finally, Morgan broke the silence. 2 possibilities. 1, Haskins saw Daniel Holbrook, and his memory has distorted the details over time, made him seem taller, stranger, more threatening than he actually was. 2, Haskins saw exactly what he described, and we have no explanation for it. There's a 3rd possibility, Hendricks said. He didn't see anything at all. It was shadows, fatigue, and 34 years of guilt for not stopping to help has created a false memory. You don't believe that? I don't know what I believe anymore. They returned to the evidence. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit had compiled a profile of Daniel Holbrook, based on interviews with his brother Vincent, medical records they'd managed to locate, and the physical evidence from his camp. The picture that emerged was deeply troubling. Daniel had suffered severe childhood abuse at the hands of his father. He'd been diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder in his late teens, but had refused treatment, distrusting doctors and medication. He'd experienced auditory and visual hallucinations, periods of paranoia, and episodes of dissociation where he'd lose time and not remember his actions. Vincent had described incidents where Daniel would disappear into the woods for days, sometimes weeks, returning malnourished and disoriented. He'd claimed to feel safer in the wilderness, away from people, away from the voices in his head. The isolation seemed to calm him, but it also deepened his disconnection from reality. In his mental state, the FBI psychologist explained during a conference call, Daniel could have experienced Rachel as a threat, even if she posed none. A car arriving in a dark parking lot, unexpected sounds, anything could have triggered a paranoid episode. If he confronted her and she reacted with fear or tried to run, he might have escalated to violence without fully understanding what he was doing. But there's no evidence of violence on the remains, Hendricks pointed out. No trauma to the bones. Strangulation, suffocation, drowning, these can kill without leaving skeletal evidence, and given his physical strength and her smaller build, he could have overpowered her quickly. It was a plausible scenario. Daniel, living rough in the forest, sees Rachel's car arrive. In his paranoid state, he perceives her as a threat or an opportunity. He approaches. She's frightened. Something happens. A struggle, an attack, an accident. He kills her, perhaps not fully cognizant of his actions. Then, realizing what he's done, he buries her body near his camp and flees. He makes it to Montana, still running from what he's done, and dies alone in the mountains, taking his secrets with him. It all fit, except for the parts that didn't. Morgan spent a week tracking down other witnesses from the factory, people who'd worked there in 1990 and might remember something useful. Most had moved away or passed on, but she found Sarah Chen, the quality control worker Marcus Webb had mentioned, the one who'd claimed to see something watching from the forest. Sarah was 58 now, a manager at a manufacturing plant in Columbus. She agreed to meet Morgan at a coffee shop downtown. "I haven't thought about that place in years," Sarah said, stirring sugar into her latte. "But when I heard on the news that they found Rachel, all those old memories came back. I worked with her, not closely, but we'd chat sometimes in the break room. She was nice, quiet, didn't deserve what happened. Your supervisor mentioned that you'd seen something in the woods behind the plant, something that made you uncomfortable." Sarah's expression tightened. "I knew Marcus told you. He thought I was being paranoid. Maybe I was, but I know what I saw. Tell me." It was September, about a month before Rachel disappeared. I was working a late shift, locking up the facility around 10 p.m. I was walking to my car and I had this feeling. You know that feeling when you're being watched? The hair on your neck stands up. I turned and looked at the tree line, and there was something there. Something? A shape. Standing between two trees, maybe 30 yards into the woods. It was dark, so I couldn't see details, but it was big, bigger than a person should be, and it was just standing there, completely still, watching me. How do you know it was watching you? I could feel it. I know that sounds crazy, but I could feel its attention on me like a weight. I stood there frozen for I don't know how long. Then I heard Marcus calling my name from inside. He'd forgotten something and come back. I looked away for a second, and when I looked back, the shape was gone. "Did you go into the woods to check?" Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Are you kidding? I ran to my car, locked the doors, and drove home. I told Marcus the next day, but I downplayed it. Said it was probably a deer or a person. But I didn't believe that. Deer don't stand like that. People don't feel like that." "Like what?" "Wrong. It felt wrong. Like it didn't belong in our world." "I know how that sounds, Detective. I'm an educated woman. I believe in science and logic. But I also trust my instincts, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to get away from that place." "Did you ever see it again?" "No. But I'd feel it sometimes. That sensation of being watched. Usually at night, usually when I was alone." A few other workers mentioned similar feelings, but no one wanted to talk about it openly. We all had bills to pay, families to feed. You don't keep a job by claiming there's something in the woods watching you. Morgan showed Sarah a photograph of Daniel Holbrook, taken from his West Virginia ID. "Could this have been the person you saw?" Sarah studied the image carefully. "Maybe. The height could be right if he was standing on elevated ground. But I don't think so. This man looks normal. What I saw didn't look normal. I can't explain it better than that." The interviews continued. Morgan found 3 other former factory workers who reported similar experiences. Feelings of being watched, strange noises from the forest, glimpses of movement or shadows that didn't behave like animals or people. None of them had reported these incidents officially. All of them had rationalized their experiences, attributed them to stress or imagination or wildlife. But when taken together, the accounts painted a disturbing picture. Something had been in those woods in 1990. Whether it was Daniel Holbrook or something else, multiple witnesses had sensed a presence that frightened them on an instinctive level. Hendricks met with Dr. Patricia Moreau, a wildlife biologist from Ohio State University, to discuss the animal bones found at Daniel's camp and mixed with Rachel's remains. The bones show clear signs of human processing, Dr. Moreau explained, displaying photographs on her tablet. Breaking open long bones to access marrow, removing meat from joints. This is consistent with someone living off the land, hunting or scavenging animals for food. What about these marks? Hendricks pointed to scoring on several bones. Your colleague said they were unusual. They are. Most of the processing marks are what you'd expect. Impact fractures from rocks, scraping from knives or sharp stones. But these particular marks are different. They're deeper, more regular, almost like claw marks. But they're on bones that were already processed, already stripped of meat. Could they be from scavengers? Animals digging up the remains after burial? That's the most logical explanation, but the pattern bothers me. They're very uniform, very deliberate. I've seen thousands of scavenger marks in my career. Bears, coyotes, wolves. This doesn't quite match any of them. What does it match? Dr. Moreau hesitated. Nothing I'm familiar with, which doesn't mean much. It could be a bear with an unusual claw pattern, or damage from something we're not considering. But if I'm being honest, these marks puzzle me. The evidence was fragmentary, contradictory, frustrating. For every rational explanation, there was a detail that didn't quite fit. For every witness who saw nothing unusual, there was another who'd felt that presence in the woods, that sensation of being watched by something that shouldn't exist. Hendricks drove out to the forest one last time in late June. He stood at the excavation site where Rachel's body had been found, now filled in and already being reclaimed by vegetation. The forest was green and alive, bird song filling the air. It felt different in summer, less threatening. But as evening approached and shadows lengthened, that old feeling returned. The silence, the weight of unseen attention. He thought about Daniel Holbrook, alone and broken, hiding in these woods. He thought about Rachel Mercer, working late, walking to her car, encountering something in the darkness. He thought about all the witnesses, all the strange details, all the pieces that didn't quite fit together. And he thought about the question that had haunted him since 1990. What really happened here? The official conclusion was straightforward. Daniel Holbrook, suffering from severe mental illness, had killed Rachel Mercer during a psychotic episode. The exact method of death was unknown due to decomposition, but strangulation or suffocation was most likely. He'd buried her body near his camp, then fled to Montana where he died from exposure. Case closed. But Hendricks knew the truth was never that simple. There were too many unknowns, too many shadows that couldn't be explained by one troubled man living in the woods. As he walked back to his car in the gathering dusk, he heard something. A branch breaking deep in the forest. Heavy footfalls moving parallel to his path. He stopped, listening. The footsteps stopped too. He turned toward the sound, but the undergrowth was too thick to see more than a few yards. "Hello!" he called out. His voice sounded small in the vast silence. No answer. Just the whisper of wind through leaves. He continued to his car, walking faster now, that primal part of his brain urging him to run. Behind him, he heard the footsteps resume, keeping pace. Not following exactly, but tracking. Watching. Hendricks reached his vehicle, got in, locked the doors. He sat there for a moment, breathing hard, feeling foolish and frightened in equal measure. He looked back at the forest. Nothing moved. Nothing visible, anyway. But as he drove away, his headlights swept across the tree line. And for just a moment, less than a second, he thought he saw something. Tall. Too tall. Standing where the light met the darkness. Then it was gone, and he was on the empty highway and the forest fell away behind him. Was Daniel Holbrook the only thing in those woods 34 years ago? Or was there something else? something that watched and waited, something that still remains. Part 4. The official report was filed in July 2024. Rachel Ann Mercer, deceased October 24, 1990, homicide by person or persons identified as Daniel Edward Holbrook. Method: undetermined due to decomposition. Motive: unclear, likely related to suspect's documented mental illness and paranoid ideation. The case was marked as solved, the file archived, and the media moved on to newer tragedies. But for those who'd lived with the mystery for 34 years, closure was more complicated. Emma Mercer requested a meeting with Hendricks in early August. They sat in his office, his last month before retirement, surrounded by boxes of case files and commendations he was preparing to pack away. Emma looked older than her 40 years, weathered by the weight of unanswered questions finally answered, but not in the way she'd hoped. "I need to understand," she said, her voice steady but strained. "What he did to her. How she died. I know you don't have all the answers, but I need whatever you have." Hendricks had been dreading this conversation. "The physical evidence doesn't tell us exactly how she died. No trauma to the bones, no definitive cause of death. Based on the circumstances, the FBI believes Daniel Holbrook encountered your mother as she was leaving work. There may have been a confrontation. Given his mental state and physical strength, he could have overpowered her quickly. Strangulation or suffocation is most likely." "Did she suffer?" The question every family member asked, the question that had no good answer. "I don't know, Emma. I wish I could tell you she didn't, but I honestly don't know." Emma was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. "My earliest memory of my mum is her brushing my hair before school. She was always gentle, always patient, even when she was tired. She worked so hard to give me a normal life after the divorce. And then one day she just didn't come home. I waited by the window all night watching for her car. Grandma kept saying she'd be there soon, but I knew. Even at 6 years old, I knew something terrible had happened. I'm sorry we couldn't give you answers sooner. You never stopped looking, Grandma told me that. She'd see you sometimes driving past the factory and she'd say, 'That detective still cares.' That meant something to us. To know someone still cared when everyone else had forgotten." After Emma left, Hendricks sat alone in his office as afternoon light slanted through the windows. He'd solved the case. He'd brought Rachel home. By any measurable standard, he'd succeeded. So why did it feel incomplete? Morgan knocked on his doorframe. "Got a minute?" "Always." She came in, closing the door behind her. "I've been doing something off the books. Probably should have told you earlier, but I wanted to be sure before I brought it to you." "What kind of something?" "I've been researching historical accounts from this region. Missing persons, unexplained deaths, strange incidents dating back to the 1800s. Specifically, accounts involving the forests around the factory site." Hendricks felt a familiar unease. "Why?" "Because I wanted to know if Daniel Holbrook was really the only explanation for everything that happened. So I went through newspaper archives, historical society records, even old sheriff's reports from before the records were digitized." She opened a folder, spreading photocopies across his desk. Yellowed newspaper clippings, handwritten reports, faded photographs. 1952, she pointed to one article. "A hunter goes missing in the same forest. Found 3 weeks later, dead from exposure, 7 miles from where he disappeared. No explanation for how he got that far or why he left his gear behind. People get lost in forests." 1973, 2 teenagers camping report being stalked by something they describe as wrong-shaped, too tall, moving wrong. They flee in the middle of the night. Locals dismiss it as a prank or overactive imaginations. Scared kids in the dark. 1981, construction workers building a logging road report equipment going missing, strange tracks in the mud, the feeling of being watched. 3 workers quit the job, refuse to go back. One of them tells a reporter, off the record, that he saw something standing at the tree line at dawn. "Tall as hell," he says, "and I got the feeling it didn't want us there." Hendricks studied the documents. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm showing you a pattern. Every decade or so, something happens in these woods. People disappear, or they see something, or they feel something that makes them afraid. And it's always the same forest, the same general area, the same descriptions, tall, wrong proportions, watching, waiting. And you think what? That there's something living out there that's been there for over a century? Morgan met his eyes. I think we closed this case by blaming a dead man who can't defend himself. And maybe he was responsible. Maybe Daniel Holbrook killed Rachel Mercer in a psychotic episode, and all these other incidents are coincidence, misidentification, and local folklore. That's the rational explanation, and it's probably correct. But I've been a cop for 19 years. I've learned to trust evidence, but I've also learned to trust my gut. And my gut says there's something in those woods that we don't understand. Something that's been there a long time. Something that Daniel Holbrook might have encountered just like Rachel did. You're talking about a creature, a cryptid, like Bigfoot. I'm talking about the possibility that we don't know everything. That there are things in remote places that we haven't catalogued, haven't explained, haven't even imagined. The world's a big place, Sheriff, and these forests are deep and old. Who knows what might survive in them? Hendricks wanted to dismiss it. Every rational part of his brain rejected the idea. But he remembered standing in those woods at dusk, hearing footsteps that matched his pace. He remembered the testimony of multiple witnesses, all describing something similar. He remembered those scratches on Rachel's car, those unusual marks on the bones. Even if I believed you, he said carefully, what would you want me to do? We can't reopen the case based on speculation and folklore. I know, and I'm not asking you to. The case is closed. Emma has her mother back. Daniel Holbrook has been identified. Justice, such as it is, has been served. But I needed you to know that I don't think we have the full story. I don't think we ever will. After Morgan left, Hendricks sat with those documents for hours, reading accounts from different decades, different witnesses, different circumstances. But the thread was there, faint, but present. Something in the woods. Something that didn't want to be found, but couldn't help being glimpsed occasionally, at the edges of human perception. He thought about Daniel Holbrook, troubled and afraid, living rough in the forest. Had he been alone out there? Or had he encountered something else, something that frightened even a man already divorced from reality? The next week, Hendricks made one final trip to Montana. He stood at the unmarked grave where Daniel Holbrook had been buried for 34 years, now with a simple stone marker identifying him by name. The cemetery overlooked mountains that stretched endlessly into the distance, their peaks still capped with snow even in August. I don't know what happened out there, Hendricks said to the grave, feeling foolish but needing to speak. I don't know if you killed Rachel Mercer or if you were running from something else. I don't know if you were a victim or a perpetrator, but you're part of this story now, whether you wanted to be or not. The wind moved through the pines, carrying the smell of distant rain. Hendricks thought about the camp in the ravine, the way Daniel had lived like something feral, hidden and afraid. He thought about the hunter's account of seeing Daniel in the woods, those wild eyes, that sense of danger. And he thought about the fact that Daniel had run, all the way to Montana, all the way to these mountains, as if trying to put as much distance as possible between himself and something he'd encountered in those Ohio forests. I hope you found peace, Hendricks said finally. Whatever happened, I hope you found peace in the end. He never got an answer, of course, just the wind and the mountains and the endless sky. Hendricks retired in September 2024, handing over his badge and his responsibilities after 43 years in law enforcement. There was a small ceremony, a plaque, handshakes and well wishes. Morgan Ellis was promoted to detective, taking over his caseload. Life moved forward as it always does. But 3 weeks into his retirement, Hendricks received a package. No return address, postmarked from somewhere in West Virginia. Inside was a letter, handwritten on lined paper, and a photograph. The letter was from Vincent Holbrook. Detective Hendricks, I heard they closed Rachel Mercer's case, put it all on Danny. Maybe that's fair. Maybe that's justice. I don't know anymore. But there's something I didn't tell you when we talked. Something I've kept to myself for almost 30 years because I knew how it would sound. In early November 1990, right before Danny disappeared for good, he called me. 3 in the morning, calling from a payphone somewhere, wouldn't say where. He was crying, hysterical, saying things that didn't make sense. He kept saying he'd seen something in the woods, something that shouldn't exist, something that had been watching him. I thought it was his illness talking, the paranoia, the hallucinations. I told him to come home, get help, take his medication. He said he couldn't, said it wouldn't let him, said if he stopped moving it would find him. I told him he was sick, that there was nothing in the woods. That's when he said something I'll never forget. It's always been there, Vince. In all those places, all the dark places where we used to hide when we were kids. It's always been there watching. And now it knows I saw it. Now it won't stop. That was the last time I ever talked to my brother. He hung up and I never heard from him again. When I heard he died in Montana, frozen in the mountains, I wondered if he was still running, still trying to get away from whatever he thought he'd seen. I'm not saying Danny didn't kill that woman. Maybe he did. He was capable of violence when his mind went bad. But I'm also not saying he did, because part of me wonders if something else was in those woods that night. Something that both Danny and Rachel Mercer encountered. I'm sending you a photo. Danny sent it to me in October 1990, about a week before he called me that last time. He didn't write anything on it, just put it in an envelope with my address. I think maybe he wanted someone to know, to have evidence. I don't know what to believe anymore, but I thought you should have this. Vincent Holbrook. Hendricks' hands were shaking as he pulled the photograph from the envelope. It was old, the colors faded, but still clear enough to see. It showed a section of forest, trees thick with autumn foliage, evening light filtering through the canopy. And there, in the background, partially obscured by a tree trunk, but definitely visible, was a shape. Tall, too tall. The proportions wrong. Body too thin. Limbs too long, posture somehow both human and utterly alien. It was standing completely still, and though the image quality made it hard to see details, Hendricks could make out what might have been a head turned toward the camera. Watching. Always watching. The photo could be faked. Could be a trick of light and shadow. Could be a person standing on something, their features distorted by motion blur or poor focus. There were a dozen rational explanations, but Hendricks had been in those woods. He'd felt that presence, he'd heard those footsteps in the dark. And looking at this photograph, he felt the same primal fear he'd felt that evening when he'd glimpsed something at the tree line as he drove away. He didn't show the photograph to anyone. He filed it away in a personal box in his basement, along with his copies of the Rachel Mercer case file. He told himself he was protecting Vincent Holbrook's privacy, protecting the integrity of the closed case. But really, he was protecting himself from having to confront what the photograph might mean. Some questions, he'd learned, were better left unanswered. Emma Mercer moved forward with her life. She'd kept her mother's memory alive for her own children, telling them about the grandmother they'd never met, her kindness, her strength, her love. Rachel's story had an ending now, however imperfect. That was more than many families ever got. On the anniversary of finding her mother's remains, Emma visited the grave with flowers. As she was leaving the cemetery, she noticed someone standing near the gate, an old man, weathered and tired, watching her. Sheriff Hendricks, retired now but still carrying the weight of the case. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said as she approached. "You have as much right to be here as anyone," Emma replied. "More, maybe." They stood together in the autumn sunlight, surrounded by stones and memories. "Do you have nightmares?" Emma asked suddenly. "About what happened?" Hendricks was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes. Not about what we found, about what we didn't find, the pieces that don't fit, the questions we couldn't answer. Like what really happened that night." "Yes." Emma looked back at her mother's grave. "I've made peace with not knowing everything. She's home. That's what matters. But I wonder sometimes if there was more to the story than just Daniel Holbrook, if there was something else out there." "What makes you say that?" "Because I've been having dreams, not nightmares exactly, but dreams about the forest, about something tall and ancient standing among the trees, watching, waiting, and in the dreams, my mother sees it, just for a moment, in her headlights or at the edge of her vision, and she's not scared, just aware. Like she suddenly understood that the world was bigger and stranger than she'd ever imagined. They're just dreams." "I know," Emma smiled sadly, "but they feel real. They feel true. And sometimes I think maybe that's the real tragedy, not just that she died, but that she encountered something incredible and terrifying, and no one will ever believe it. They said their goodbyes. Hendricks watched Emma drive away, then walked through the cemetery to where Dorothy Mercer was buried beside her daughter. He stood there for a long time, thinking about all the years Dorothy had waited for answers, all the hope that had slowly withered into grief. "I did my best," he told her. "It wasn't enough, it's never enough, but I tried." The wind moved through the trees overhead, carrying leaves down like memories falling, and for just a moment, Hendricks felt at peace. The forest outside of town remained unchanged. Seasons cycled through, autumn to winter to spring to summer and back again. The old factory continued its slow collapse, metal rusting, walls crumbling, nature consuming what humanity had built. The parking lot where Rachel's car had been found was now indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape, and deep in the woods, where the trees grew thick and old, where sunlight barely penetrated the canopy, something moved. Something that had been there long before the factory, before the town, before humans had carved roads through the wilderness. Something that watched and waited, existing in the spaces between knowing and not knowing, between belief and skepticism. Hunters still avoided certain parts of the forest. Hikers reported strange feelings, the sensation of being observed. Local teenagers told stories around campfires, tales that grew with each telling. And every few years someone would glimpse something at the tree line, something tall, something wrong, something that vanished before it could be truly seen. The rational world dismissed these accounts. Misidentification, shadows, imagination. The human mind's tendency to find patterns where none existed, to create monsters in the darkness. But those who'd been in the forest at the wrong time, in the wrong place, who'd felt that presence and survived, they knew differently. They knew that some mysteries weren't meant to be solved, that some questions led only to more questions, that the world held depths humanity had barely begun to explore. Paul Hendricks lived out his retirement in relative peace. He gardened, spent time with his grandchildren, took long drives through the Ohio countryside. He never spoke publicly about the photograph Vincent Holbrook had sent him. He never discussed his theories about what might have been in those woods. But on quiet evenings, when the sun set and shadows grew long, he'd think about Rachel Mercer, about Daniel Holbrook, about all the witnesses who'd seen something they couldn't explain. And he'd wonder. In the end, that's all any of us can do. Wonder, question. Stand at the edge of the unknown and accept that some truths live in the spaces between evidence and belief, between the world we think we know and the world that actually exists. Rachel Mercer's case was solved. The file was closed. Justice, as defined by human systems, had been served. But in the deep woods of southeastern Ohio, where the trees grow ancient and the darkness runs deep, something still watches, still waits, still moves through the shadows on nights when the fog rolls in and the moon hides behind clouds. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly as it should be. Some mysteries are meant to endure, reminding us that for all our science and reason, for all our certainty and our systems, the world remains wild and strange and full of things we cannot explain. Rachel Mercer walked into that darkness on an October evening in 1990. What she encountered there, whether it was just a troubled man or something far stranger, we may never truly know. But her story endures, and the forest remembers. Always, the forest remembers.